Okay, thanks everyone for coming. I'm talking today on the biodiversity of Plum Island, just off of northern fork of Long Island. And this has been a collaborative project over the past year and a half or so with multiple co-authors, including one I just met a second ago. Primarily, it's been the work of my program, the New York Natural Heritage Program. So I want to acknowledge Asa Feldman and Steve Young, who couldn't be here, but we wrote a report and are presenting on that report today. But we had a lot of collaborators that are listed here, including Tim and others who are speaking today. So I want to thank all of them as well. You might know that the future ownership of Plum Island, which is where the Animal Disease Laboratory is housed, is uncertain. And to that end, the Nature Conservancy funded us to conduct a study of all the available biodiversity information that we could compile for Plum Island. And so that's what this report is about. You said I could point this anywhere. Okay. Some of the questions we asked in this report included, what do we know about Plum Island's biodiversity? We broke that into 3 categories. This is sort of a traditional natural heritage methodology grouping: natural communities, plants, and animals. And I'll touch on each of those today, keeping in mind that Asa led the natural community piece, Steve led the plant piece, and I led the animal piece. So questions about the natural community and plant pieces, I will try to skillfully deflect for another time. And some of these are elements that I don't know that well, but I'll do my best to give you an overview of them. Then what rare species could potentially occur on Plum Island but have not been discovered? And we asked this mainly because there has not been a lot of survey work of this island. With the exception of plants and birds, we know very little about the island's fauna, but it has the potential to host a lot of rare species, and so I'll be talking about that today. Finally, what is the potential of the island with management and restoration? And again, I'll just touch on that briefly, talk about some management and restoration opportunities that exist there. So what this presentation is not: results of New York Natural Heritage fieldwork. And I say that because the 3 primary co-authors on this report and this talk, we haven't done fieldwork on this island. We haven't been allowed to do fieldwork on this island. And at the moment, the island is essentially closed to future fieldwork until the results of the potential sale are determined. Many of the co-authors you saw at the beginning have done fieldwork there. It's also not a stance on the future ownership of the island. I'm not going to talk politics here. Better stay away from those things. And this won't be anything but science and natural history. So no Montauk monsters, no Jesse's Ventura conspiracy theories today. We'll save those maybe for lunchtime or cocktails. Okay, just so we're all on the same Google Maps page, Plum Island is there off the North Fork, off of Orient Point. Runs in a little archipelago that includes Great and Little Gull Islands and Fisher's Island, and then continuing to Connecticut. It's famously referred to as a pork chop-shaped island, which, well, self-explanatory why it's referred to that way. A brief history. Native American use of the island appeared to be mainly hunting, fishing, growing corn. In 1638, it was sold to a settler named Samuel Willis, and it was farmed for about 200 years. The lighthouse there was built in 1827. In 1898, the government purchased some more land and constructed Fort Terry, which was the military installation, and then the government took full control of the island in 1901. That fort was decommissioned after World War II, and in 1954, the Animal Disease Laboratory was built and operated. And then in 2008, the island has been proposed for sale with the potential movement of the Animal Disease Laboratory to Kansas. So first, I'd like to talk about natural community mapping. Nobody had ever really done a vegetation map or a natural community map of Plum Island before, and so that was one of our tasks here. And this was Asa's work, and I want to show you basically what this looks like. You start mainly with aerial photos. Again, this was informed a lot by some on-the-ground work of Eric Lamont and Richard Stalter, but it was not, the mapping itself was done remotely using aerial photos. So ESA used fine-scale resolution resolution imagery from 2007. And just to show you a zoom in to give you an idea of just how fine a resolution she could get, here's that water tower. You can see very well patterns of vegetation. In some cases, you can identify vegetation to species. Zooming out again, this is her final line work that show the polygons of different natural community types on Plum Island. We'll look in a little bit more detail at the wetland complex that's on the sort of south end of the island. ESA identified 3 natural communities making up this, that I'm showing right here anyway, a deep emergent marsh of 29 acres, successional maritime forest that's 8 acres, and a high bush blueberry bog thicket that's 44 acres. These natural community types are translatable to the National Vegetation Classification and crosswalk to a lot of other vegetation types, vegetation classifications. This is ESA's final, on early versions of this, it said something like final draft preliminary hypothetical remotely sensed map. You know, she's was not giving herself enough credit, but this is the final vegetation map without being ground truth. So this is what she was able to determine from aerial photos. And I think it was, I meant to count the communities. It's about 38 natural communities, or natural and cultural communities that she identified on the island. Here's a couple examples, not from Plum Island. We don't have a lot of photos of Plum Island here in the talk because typically when you go, even on a visit, they don't allow you to take a lot of photos there. We have a few that have been sneaked in over the years. This is, I think, dunes at Napeague, but there's a nice dune community on Plum Island. There's also what's referred to as Maritime Bluff up in the back there with these sort of sloping and heavily eroded features like that one. This is, I think, Camp Hero. So that Maritime Bluff and then the Maritime Beach, and also showing an intertidal, rocky intertidal community there at the far north. No, up, sorry. North is not always up, right, got it, okay. I came south from Albany last night and then east to Long Island this morning, and my directions are all out of whack. Plants. Again, this is Steve's young work. He wanted to give a little history of former plant studies on Plum Island. Charles Graves in 1895, leading up to a recent 7-year flora that Eric Lamont and Richard Stalter have compiled. And that's a work in progress. They're hoping to publish that soon. In the meantime, they've identified a total of 420 plant taxa that have been documented on Plum Island, 391 of which are intact, extant. One example is Scotch lovage there on the there. And the result, this is quite a large flora for such a small island. This island is about 840 acres. And, is that right? 840. And results from the diversity of natural communities that ESA found. So in comparison to some other places, Plum Island has 840 acres and 420 taxa recorded. The largest known flora is that in New York is Fisher's Island at 961 taxa, but it's also about 3 times the size of Plum Island. So to give you an idea here, there's Fire Island next to the bottom at about 6 or 7 times the size of Plum Island, but with fewer taxa recorded than Plum Island. And this diversity of habitats, marine, upland, freshwater wetland, is what, and dunes is what gives you such a diversity of plants. And there are many rare plants on Plum Island. 14 existing or extant rare plants, 6 of which are endangered, 5 listed threatened, and 3 listed rare. Those are official state designations. And then there are 6 historical rare plants that no longer appear to occur on Plum Island. You can see a few of those examples here. And a few more examples, sea beach knotweed being a beach species, and And I don't know anything else about those plants, I'm afraid to say. They're quite pretty, though, they're good food for animals. Steve had a quote in an earlier version of this talk that said, somebody invented animals to move plant seeds around. And so he just wanted to dismiss, the notion that animals were more important than plants, which they're not. And there's some very cool plants here. But Atlantic white cedar is one of them. There used to be an Atlantic white cedar swamp on Plum Island, which is a really rare natural community in New York. There are still scattered trees, and you can see the stumps of this. In fact, even from aerial photos, you can see the remnants of this Atlantic white cedar swamp. We're back to this exploitably vulnerable. For those who saw Tim's talk, this is a category that's showy plants protected from picking without the permission of the landowner. And so there are ones that are predicted to become more rare with excessive harvest. And there are 15 of those on Plum Island, including a sundew, fern, and an orchid. And Steve dug up this historical aerial photo to show you how the island might have acquired some of its exotics, which it has a lot of invasive plants. So the comparison of 1954 on the left versus 2004 on the right, you can see a lot of these trails or survey lines running toward the center of the island. This is before the lab was built. There's the lab in 2004, and another portion of the lab here. And this was just as they were getting built. And you can see those survey lines running in, which could very easily bring seeds of invasive species in toward the center. Another example of that here, again, 1954 versus 2004. You can see all these kind of roads and trails and survey lines, especially up in here. And here are some of the exotics that we know occur on Plum Island: purple loosestrife, European giant reed, otherwise known as Phragmites, Asian bittersweet, and autumn olive. Now I'll talk about animals. This is a quote I got from a Wall Street Journal article. The island has no wildlife and no animal leaves Plum Island alive. The intonation is mine. That wasn't, written in the article. So there's a sense from a lot of the popular works on Plum Island and a lot of the conspiracy websites, which you find if you Google Plum Island enough, that it's this sort of biological desert and nothing's allowed to live there, and they shoot all animals on sight because they don't want them to catch disease, and that is only partially true. So I'll explain in a little more detail as we talk about some of the animals that we know have occurred and do occur on Plum Island. So here are the known animals that we were able to compile from museum records, historical literature, more recent literature, personal communications with scientists and biologists from USDA and others who have worked on the island. We were able to compile a list of mammals that included meadow vole and white-footed mouse in the lower left, muskrat, white-tailed deer, raccoon, a ghostly fox here in the lower right corner because we just have kind of a fox spur from scat, and we don't know which species of fox. And then evidence of beaver, and that was kind of significant because it was one of the first occurrences of beaver on Long Island in a very long time, and they were documented there in 2003. Deer are an interesting story because that is the one animal they don't allow on Plum Island. And when deer swim to shore, which they do, and they swim to Plum Island regularly enough, they are culled. They're concerned about the animal diseases that they study in the laboratory passing to deer and then getting passed to wild populations. And surveys haven't been done for a lot of other mammals that could be of interest. So bats have not been surveyed for on Plum Island, even though there was some avian radar set up that could detect the presence of bats, but those data remain unanalyzed and would cost a lot to do that. So, but there's the potential for a lot of the underground bunkers and historical buildings to serve as roost sites for bats, and potentially as a bit of a I guess, a refugium from white nose syndrome. If these are bunkers that have not had infected bats in them, there's a possibility that they could remain that way. That's the New England cottontail on the upper right, and that's a species that is historical from Long Island, has not been documented on Long Island in many decades, but Plum Island appears to have the kind of habitat that would be ideal for them. Very shrubby, thick, lots of undergrowth. And at the moment, no rabbit has ever been detected from the island. If we can determine that they were historical there, it could be a potential reintroduction site. And if you'll pardon this sort of cartoon, but Mike Bettini came to me with this idea that Plum Island could be an important stepping stone, like it may have been for beaver to recolonize Plum Island, or excuse me, to recolonize Long Island. It could also be a way for other animals native to Long Island to repopulate Long Island. So that includes the river otter, which he just spoke about in the other room. Oops, the beaver, which jumps really fast, and then there's a fisher and a coyote, which have just been documented on Fisher's Island. And Plum Island could be an important stepping stone for them to get to mainland Long Island again. Birds. So birds, as I mentioned, are one of the better studied groups. Audubon, New York, has been on there for, somebody can correct me in the room, 6 years, something like that. And as of January of this year, they documented, in combination with other surveys by Mary Laura Lamont and a few other biologists, had documented 187 species of birds using Plum Island. Now, that number's gone up a little bit. I think there were a couple new species added this summer. I don't have those tallies here, but 198, more than a couple have been added. Thank you, John. 58 of that 187 were at-risk species. That's a lot of at-risk species for that bird fauna. And then in addition, 65 of those 187 were documented as breeders, which gives you an intersection of 13 breeding at-risk species in an 840-acre island. Some of those are here. We'll start in the upper middle with the northern harrier, and I'll spare you the laser pointer, but northern harrier, American black duck. We'll continue clockwise with the royal tern, common tern, piping plover at the bottom center, brown thrasher, the lower left. Toward the center, we've got a least bittern, which was seen by Paul Spitzer doing osprey research in 1970s in the freshwater wetland. That's a state-threatened bird that hasn't been documented since. And then common eider, which has been, I think is considered a probable breeder. I don't think they've found a nest or enough evidence to call it a definite nester, but that is one of only 2 locations in New York for common eiders that breed, the other being Fisher's Island. And then that's the American oyster catcher right below it. Pretty impressive bird fauna, but not as impressive as it used to be, and I'll talk a little bit about that now. Plum Island used to contain the largest breeding colony of osprey on the eastern seaboard, or at least in the New York and southern New England area. I think there were about 200 osprey nests. I meant to double check that number, but something like 200 osprey nests into the 1890s or so. That colony disappeared when trees were cut down, for one, and the breeding colonies of wading birds disappeared also, starting in the early 1900s. So now most of these ospreys have moved over to Gardner's Island, and there's still about somewhere between 6 and 15 osprey nests per year on Plum Island. So they're still breeding there, but not in the great numbers that they once were. This is the story of the wading bird rookeries that used to live on Plum Island. Snowy egret, great egret, glossy ibis, and black-crowned night heron, all in pretty good numbers from some Long Island-wide surveys and New England surveys until about 1995. So I'll just point that out here. 1995, we declined to 2,000, there are none. Glossy ibis, by 2000, there are none. Black-crowned night heron, none. Great egret, almost none in 2000. Luckily, this is the only bird group that happened to it. Oh, except the gulls, right? Yeah, so this happened to gulls too. So there was a really nice gull colony on Plum Island too, which increased in the 70s and 80s and then sharply declined between 1995 and 2001. And if only we could figure out what happened in right around 1985 that would help us determine what happened to these birds. Well, these guys stowed away on a ship on one of the boats going to Plum Island apparently, and have decimated the bird colonies there. Now, raccoons are and have been controlled by the USDA, by APHIS, for some of the same reasons. Just they're kind of pesky, and I don't think they're concerned about their diseases spreading to them so much as they are. They're just kind of troublesome and get into the garbage. And so they control them, but they haven't made an effort to eradicate raccoons from Plum Island. And so until they do, I think these breeding bird colonies couldn't really come back. A little bit on marine species, and if you had made a wiser decision, you would be over listening to Rob Giovanni talk about marine species, mammals and sea turtles, New York-wide. But here on Plum Island is the state's largest seal haul-out colony. Up to 600 animals have been documented there. And that includes both harbor seals, as depicted in the top photo, and gray seals, which are on the lower left. Gray seals have been increasing in numbers lately in New York waters, and they've been seen, I've seen them off the coast of Plum Island on my one visit there. The waters around Plum Island are important, appear to be important passageways for species like the northern right whale, and that's the short-nosed sturgeon. Sorry, it's a sturgeon. And then the waters around Plum Island are also populated by sea turtles, as you probably know. There is some seagrass around Plum Island. We don't know whether sea turtles use that particular patch of seagrass or not. That's another piece of survey work we'd like to get done. The marine invertebrate community is rich and one of the richest in the whole region. There's blue crabs, there's hard clams. That's a picture of a marine rocky intertidal in the center. Horseshoe crabs are in the surrounding waters, but we don't know whether they've been, to what degree they breed on Plum Island, and whether that's therefore an important stopover point for red knots. And that's a talk that's happening later right here, I think right after this talk. And that's an American lobster in the lower right. Again, this is the region surrounding Plum Island, so it's not Plum Island specific because people haven't done the survey work. But Plum Gut, which is the channel that runs between Orient Point and Plum Island itself, has had a fair bit of survey work, and it's a really rich fish community there, marine fish, and an important foraging point for a lot of seabirds. Okay, known reptiles and amphibians. Again, from scattered survey work, we've got record for spotted turtle, box turtle, one mention of diamondback terrapins being common, and no other mentions I've ever seen, and that was in a government EIS. And I haven't seen it anywhere else. Snapping turtle, green frog, and painted turtle are the known herps of Plum Island. But Plum Island has the potential for a huge host of herps that are in the surrounding area. Now, its glacial history might suggest that it's less likely for them to be there, but we don't know unless we look. So those include the northern cricket frog, as you probably know, extirpated from Long Island, the eastern spadefoot. That's a leopard frog in the upper right, and that's one of the new species of leopard frog that's been identified. Jeremy Feinberg will be talking about that at 4:30 today, I think 4:34 or 4:30 today. And nobody's surveyed for them on Plum Island. We've got marbled salamanders, tiger salamanders, ribbon snakes, black racers, hognose snake, wood turtle, and eastern mud turtle. So potential for a lot of different rare herps, and I think this would be a high survey priority for Plum Island because we don't know if they're there or not. We know very little, like with Brookhaven National Laboratory, very little about, or a lot less than the Brookhaven knows about its invertebrate fauna. We have scattered observations of butterflies and dragonflies, including a seaside dragonlet that's on the upper right, which is a Natural Heritage Tract species, salt marsh specialist. There's a picture of the beach on the lower left, and one beetle there that occurs on that beach has my favorite common name of any insect. It's the hairy-necked tiger beetle, Cicindela herticalis. And we had a contractor who Tim put up for us here at Brookhaven, and Jonathan Maudsley went out to Plum Island and documented the largest population of the hairy-necked tiger beetle that we know of statewide. This is a species that relies on an intact beach that's not heavily recreated, that's not driven on, and that is true of Plum Island's beach. And so the beach has quite a lot of elements that suggest it could remain as good breeding habitat for a lot of the kind of beach wilderness species like piping plover and some tiger beetles. So that's encouraging. I don't know what's happened since the hurricane. I don't know how heavily impacted the island was after the hurricane, and I haven't been able to find out. We looked at some of the records from the surrounding area and determined that there's the potential for 25 rare dragonflies on Plum Island. It's comet darner, Martha's pennant in the lower left, Needham's skimmer, scarlet bluet, lily pad forktail, and mottled darner. And then we had Hugh McGinnis from then of the Ross School look at the natural communities of Plum Island and some of the flora, and he determined there's the potential for 58 species of rare species of moths. No moth survey work has been conducted on Plum Island at all, but its situation in the landscape and its existing natural community suggests that there's the possibility for high diversity of rare moths there. The biggest invertebrate prize of all would be the American burying beetle. This is a federally listed species that has disappeared from almost the entire East Coast. It now is extant in one place in the Northeast, and that's Nantucket. Or is that Martha's Vineyard? That's Block Island. Did I mention my geography problems today? That's awesome. There's Block Island. There's an experimental population on Nantucket as well. Block Island is the one place in the Northeast that the American burying beetle still exists. This is a beetle that is a carrion feeder, and it buries itself into carrion. It hatches its larvae there, and the larvae eat their way out. Lovely. But it does very well with breeding bird colonies, especially if there aren't a lot of kind of mesopredators like raccoons and foxes, because there isn't as much competition for carcasses. So the habitat on Plum Island seems perfect for them. They're known historically from 3 places right in the area, so southern Connecticut, Montauk, and these towns of Greenport and Riverhead, right? And it's known historically from those places, but nobody's ever looked on Plum Island. And I corresponded with the author of the Federal Recovery Plan, and he said, well, certainly nobody has done American burying beetle surveys there, and I agree that would be a really good idea. But we haven't looked, so we don't know. But that would be quite a prize. A little bit in my remaining minutes about some management and restoration opportunities on Plum Island. The hydrology of the wetland appears to have been dramatically altered, and we're not exactly sure how. They appear to be using water for the lab in some way. And an investigation of the natural hydrology of that wetland and the potential to restore it to its full function would be really, really important, I think. I think eradicating raccoons would be a fantastic step toward restoring the breeding bird colonies that could live on Plum Island. Great Gull Island is a perfect example of what you can do to restore a breeding bird colony. Pulling invasives, there's a lot of bittersweet on the island. There's a lot of other invasives that could be eradicated or at least controlled. And then the grassland portion that's sort of at the handle of the pork chop right around the fort has the potential to be, it's mown regularly now and has the potential to be restored into a grassland that could be useful for some grassland birds. What they call it the parade grounds, and it's not managed really at all, except mowed to keep ticks down and just to make it look pretty. But I think there's the potential to restore something like 13 acres of grassland to more suitable habitat for some grassland-loving birds. So the future of Plum Island is uncertain. It, without going too much into the details, the environmental impact statement that came out this summer gives kind of short shrift to a conservation option. I believe, as a lot of my collaborators do, that there's a huge potential here for conservation, and a lot of the interest in something like a national wildlife refuge could be compatible with existing uses like a continued animal disease center there. I think with that, I'll thank a lot of people and mention that our report is available at that website, preserveplumisland.org. It is not making a case one way or another, other than to document what we know and what we don't know. And there's a lot that we don't know and a lot that we need to learn. Thank you.